Karen lived in a peaceful suburban neighborhood where everything seemed to follow a predictable rhythm. Her home was the kind that stood out, not because it was extravagant, but because of how perfectly maintained it was. The grass was always trimmed to an even height, her flower beds burst with vibrant colors, and not a single leaf dared to linger on her driveway. Karen took immense pride in her surroundings, often joking with neighbors that she had eyes in the back of her head when it came to spotting anything out of place. But Karen wasn't just focused on her own property. She kept tabs on the entire neighborhood. Whether it was noticing a car parked too long in front of someone's house or spotting a stray shopping cart left by the curb, nothing escaped her attention. Some neighbors appreciated her vigilance, while others found her constant monitoring a bit overbearing. Still, no one could deny that Karen cared deeply about keeping their community safe and orderly. One sunny afternoon, as Karen watered her blooming hydrangeas, something unusual caught her eye. Across the street, near the curb, two people were standing close together, talking and laughing. At first glance, they didn't seem threatening, just two individuals chatting casually. But as Karen squinted through the sunlight, her curiosity turned into suspicion. One of them was Marcus, a tall black man who worked for the local garbage collection company. He was easy to recognize, even without his uniform shirt, which he tied around his waist due to the heat. Next to him stood Emily, a young white college student who lived a few blocks away. To most people, this scene might have appeared completely ordinary, two acquaintances sharing a friendly conversation during a break. It happened all the time. But Karen's mind began racing with questions. Why were they talking? Did they know each other? And why wasn't Marcus wearing his full uniform? Her thoughts spiraled quickly, fueled by assumptions rather than facts. In her mind, their interaction felt off, almost inappropriate. She convinced herself that Marcus didn't belong there, that maybe he was up to something shady or bothering Emily. As Karen watched from behind her garden hose, her grip tightened on the nozzle. Her heart pounded with a mix of frustration and self-importance. This was her neighborhood, after all, and she believed it was her responsibility to step in if something seemed wrong. Without stopping to consider alternative explanations, or even approaching them to ask what was going on, she made a snap decision. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. With a tone of authority, she reported, "There's a suspicious black man near my house. He's talking to a young girl. I don't think this is right." In that moment, Karen felt confident that she was doing the right thing. After all, hadn't she always looked out for her neighbors? Hadn't she dedicated herself to ensuring the safety of their quiet little corner of the world? As she hung up the phone and stepped back inside to peek through her curtains, she waited eagerly for the police to arrive, certain that her call would resolve whatever issue she imagined was unfolding outside. Little did Karen know, her actions were about to set off a chain reaction that would change not only her life, but also the lives of those around her. Karen's fingers trembled slightly as she ended the call with 911. She placed her phone on the kitchen counter and peeked through the curtains again, watching Marcus and Emily closely. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, replaying snippets of their interaction in her head. To her, their laughter seemed too loud, their body language too relaxed. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that her decision to call the police was justified. Outside, Marcus and Emily remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. They continued chatting, occasionally chuckling at shared memories from high school. Marcus leaned casually against the garbage truck parked nearby, while Emily sat cross-legged on the curb, scrolling through photos on her phone. It was a perfectly normal scene. Two friends catching up during a quiet afternoon. But Karen's imagination painted an entirely different picture. In her version of events, Marcus was a threat, and Emily was in danger. Minutes ticked by slowly, each one stretching longer than the last for Karen. She alternated between pacing in her living room and sneaking glances out the window, growing increasingly impatient for the police to arrive. When she finally heard the distant wail of sirens, A wave of relief washed over her. Finally, she muttered under her breath, stepping back to watch the drama unfold from behind the safety of her lace curtains. Two police cars pulled up to the curb, their flashing lights casting red and blue shadows across the street. Neighbors began peeking out of their windows, curious about what had drawn law enforcement to this otherwise sleepy neighborhood. Marcus and Emily turned toward the commotion, their smiles fading into expressions of confusion and concern. One officer approached them cautiously, his hand resting near his holster as he asked, "What's going on here?" Marcus straightened up, his calm demeanor masking any irritation he might have felt. "We're just talking," he explained evenly. "I'm on my break after finishing my route." He gestured toward the garbage truck behind him as if to prove his point. Emily nodded vigorously in agreement. "Yeah, we've known each other since high school," she added, her voice tinged with annoyance. "This is ridiculous." The officers exchanged skeptical glances, but didn't find anything suspicious in their explanations. After confirming Marcus's employment with the garbage company via radio, they stepped aside, allowing the pair to go back to their conversation. With a polite nod, the officers returned to their vehicles and drove off, leaving the scene as quickly as they'd arrived. From her vantage point inside the house, Karen watched everything unfold with mounting disbelief. She had expected the police to intervene, to validate her concerns and take action against Marcus. But instead, they left without so much as a reprimand. Frustration bubbled inside her chest as she realized her plan hadn't worked out the way she'd envisioned. Rather than feeling reassured, she now felt foolish, and worse, ignored. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she noticed neighbors beginning to retreat from their windows. Some shot disapproving looks in her direction, clearly aware of who had called the cops. For a moment, Karen considered staying indoors, avoiding the awkwardness of facing anyone. But her stubborn streak won out. Grabbing her sunglasses, she marched outside, determined to confront Marcus and Emily directly. As she strode across her lawn, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, Karen tried to steel herself for the conversation ahead. She told herself she was doing the right thing, that she needed answers to ease her lingering doubts. But deep down, uncertainty gnawed at her. What if she had overreacted? What if there really was no reason to be suspicious? These questions swirled in her mind, unspoken but impossible to ignore, as she closed the distance between herself and the two individuals whose lives she had just complicated. Karen's footsteps slowed as she approached Marcus and Emily, her confidence wavering with every step. The sunlight glinted off her sunglasses, masking the unease in her eyes, but her stiff posture betrayed her discomfort. Marcus stood tall, arms crossed over his chest, while Emily perched on the curb, her phone now tucked into her pocket. Both of them watched Karen approach, their expressions a mix of irritation and disbelief. "Excuse me," Karen began, her voice clipped and overly formal. She adjusted her sunglasses as if to shield herself from more than just the sun. "I was wondering, what exactly were you two doing here?" Her tone carried an edge of accusation, as though she already knew the answer but wanted them to admit it. Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "We've been standing right here the whole time," he said evenly, his deep voice calm but firm. "You could have asked instead of calling the cops." His word hung in the air, sharp enough to make Karen flinch. Emily chimed in, her voice tinged with frustration. "Yeah, seriously. What's the big deal? We're just talking. It's not like we're doing anything illegal." She gestured between herself and Marcus, emphasizing how absurd the situation was. "And for the record, Marcus is one of my oldest friends. He's literally saved my family's trash cans from spilling onto the street more times than I can count." Karen opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. Her mind scrambled for a justification, something that would explain her actions without making her look foolish, or worse, prejudiced. "Well, she stammered, fumbling for words. "I just thought. I mean, you weren't wearing your uniform shirt," she said, pointing at Marcus. And you two seemed close. Marcus let out a short laugh, shaking his head. It's hot outside. I tied my shirt around my waist because I didn't want to sweat through it. Is that a crime now? He uncrossed his arms and took a step forward, his height making him even more imposing. Look, ma'am, I work hard every day to do my job and take care of my community. I don't need people like you questioning my intentions just because of how I look. His words hit Karen like a punch to the gut. For the first time, she felt the weight of what she'd done. Calling the police hadn't been about keeping the neighborhood safe. It had been about her own biases, the assumptions she'd made without even realizing it. She tried to defend herself, her voice rising slightly. I was just looking out for everyone's safety. You can't blame me for being cautious. Oh, we're not blaming you, Emily shot back, standing up to face Karen directly. But maybe next time, try thinking before you act. Not everything has to be some big emergency. Sometimes people are just people. The tension in the air was palpable. Neighbors who had been watching from their windows or yards began to murmur among themselves, casting disapproving glances in Karen's direction. A few shook their heads, muttering comments about how unnecessary the whole ordeal had been. One elderly woman even called out, "Leave them alone, Karen. They're fine." Feeling the heat of judgment from all sides, Karen's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She glanced around, noticing the growing crowd and the accusatory stares. Her earlier certainty crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. Desperate to salvage the situation, she forced a tight smile and said, "Well, I'm glad everything's okay then." But her words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Without waiting for a response, Karen turned on her heel and walked briskly back toward her house. Each step felt heavier than the last, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she still clung to the belief that she'd acted out of concern for her community. On the other, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she'd overstepped, a realization that gnawed at her long after she closed her front door behind her. As she leaned against the cool wood of her doorframe, Karen exhaled deeply, trying to steady her nerves. Outside, she could hear Marcus and Emily resuming their conversation, their laughter faintly drifting through the open window. The sound grated on her, a reminder of the rift she'd created. For the first time in years, Karen felt truly unsettled, not by external forces, but by the uncomfortable truths bubbling to the surface within herself. The days that followed the incident felt like an eternity for Karen. What had once been a quiet, predictable life in her suburban neighborhood now seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension she couldn't escape. Every trip outside, whether it was to check the mail or water her flowers, felt like walking into a spotlight. Neighbors who used to greet her warmly now offered polite nods at best, their smiles replaced by cold, distant stares. Some avoided eye contact altogether, whispering behind cupped hands as she passed by. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her, making even the simplest tasks feel unbearable. At home, things weren't much better. Her teenage son, Jake, had seen the entire confrontation unfold from his bedroom window and hadn't spoken to her since. When Karen tried to explain herself during dinner one evening, he pushed his plate away and glared at her. "You embarrassed us," he said flatly, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you even realize how messed up that was? Marcus is a good guy. Everyone knows him. Why would you call the cops on someone just because they're black?" Karen opened her mouth to respond but found no words. She wanted to tell Jake that she'd only been trying to protect their family, that her intentions weren't malicious. But deep down, she knew those excuses wouldn't hold up. Instead, she sat silently, picking at her food while her son stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving Karen alone with her thoughts and her guilt. To make matters worse, Emily didn't let the issue die quietly. Later that week, Karen discovered that the young woman had posted about the incident on social media. The post quickly gained traction, with screenshots of texts from Marcus detailing how often people like Karen made false accusations against him simply because of his skin color. Comments poured in from strangers and neighbors alike, criticizing Karen's behavior and labeling her as yet another Karen perpetuating racial profiling. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying the backlash. Overnight, Karen went from being a relatively unknown suburban mom to the face of a national conversation about prejudice and accountability. Reporters began calling nonstop, leaving voicemails, and sending emails requesting interviews. One bold journalist even knocked on her door, camera crew in tow, asking for a statement. Karen refused to answer, drawing the curtains tightly shut and retreating further into isolation. Each notification on her phone felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder of how far-reaching her mistake had become. Desperate to fix the damage, Karen decided to reach out to Marcus and Emily directly. She sent a carefully worded text message apologizing for her actions and expressing regret for any harm caused. To her dismay, neither responded. Days later, when she mustered the courage to knock on Emily's door, the young woman answered with crossed arms and a stony expression. "What do you want?" Emily asked bluntly. I wanted to say I'm sorry," Karen stammered, clutching her purse tightly. "I know I overreacted, and I shouldn't have called the police. I hope you can forgive me." Emily studied her for a long moment before shaking her head. "Words aren't enough," she said firmly. "Apologies don't erase what happened. If you really mean it, prove it. Do something to show you actually care." With that, Emily closed the door, leaving Karen standing on the porch, her heart heavy with shame. As she walked back to her house, she realized that fixing this wasn't going to be easy or quick. The road ahead would require more than hollow promises. It would demand real change, both within herself and in how she interacted with the world around her. For the first time, Karen understood that apologies were meaningless without action, and proving herself worthy of forgiveness would take far more effort than she'd ever imagined. The backlash from the incident continued to ripple through Karen's life, growing louder and more suffocating with each passing day. Social media posts about her actions spread like wildfire, painting her as a symbol of ignorance and prejudice. Strangers tagged her in memes and comment threads, dissecting her behavior with scathing criticism. Some even dug up old photos of her from community events, labeling her the neighborhood watchdog, or worse. It was impossible to escape the storm she had unknowingly unleashed. At first, Karen tried to defend herself. She drafted long responses to online comments, explaining that she hadn't meant any harm and insisting she was only trying to keep her community safe. But every attempt to justify her actions fell flat. The replies came flooding in, angry, sarcastic, dismissive. One particularly biting comment read, "If your idea of safety involves calling the cops on innocent people, maybe you're the real threat." Another neighbor chimed in, writing, "Karen, we've all seen how quick you are to judge others. Maybe it's time for some self-reflection." Feeling cornered and overwhelmed, Karen deleted her social media accounts altogether. She stopped answering calls from unknown numbers and avoided leaving the house unless absolutely necessary. Even trips to the grocery store became unbearable. Shoppers would whisper behind her back, and cashiers greeted her with forced smiles that barely masked their disdain. For someone who prided herself on being well-liked and respected, this sudden isolation was devastating. Her teenage son, Jake, wasn't making things easier either. He refused to ride in the same car as her, opting to walk or bike everywhere instead. When friends came over, they'd huddle in his room, their laughter muffled but unmistakable. Karen couldn't help but feel like an outsider in her own home. One evening, she overheard Jake talking to a friend on the phone. "Yeah, my mom's that lady everyone's talking about," he said bitterly. "It's so embarrassing. I don't even want to go to school anymore." That comment hit Karen harder than anything else. She realized that her actions weren't just affecting her. They were hurting the people she loved most. Determined to make amends, she reached out to a neighbor she trusted, Linda, hoping for advice. Over coffee at Linda's kitchen table, Karen poured out her frustrations and fears. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but now, I don't know what to do." Linda listened patiently, nodding occasionally but not interrupting. When Karen finished, she sighed and leaned forward. "Karen, I believe you when you say you didn't mean harm," she said gently. "But good intentions don't erase bad outcomes. If you really want to fix this, you need to take responsibility. And that means more than just saying sorry. You have to educate yourself." With Linda's encouragement, Karen decided to attend a local diversity workshop hosted by a community organization focused on racial equity. At first, the idea terrified her. What if people recognized her? What if they judged her before she even walked in the door? But Linda reassured her, reminding her that growth often requires stepping outside of one's comfort zone. Taking a deep breath, Karen signed up. On the day of the workshop, Karen arrived early, clutching her notebook like a shield. As participants trickled in, she kept her head down, avoiding eye contact. The facilitator welcomed everyone warmly, setting a tone of openness and understanding. Throughout the session, attendees shared personal stories of discrimination and bias, their voices filled with raw emotion. One woman recounted being followed around a store simply because of her skin color. A young man described how teachers underestimated him in school because of stereotypes. Each story struck a chord within Karen, forcing her to confront the reality of systemic racism and its impact on everyday lives. By the end of the workshop, Karen felt both humbled and inspired. She realized that her assumptions about Marcus and Emily weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern of behavior rooted in fear and ignorance. For the first time, she understood why her call to the police had been so harmful. It wasn't just about one moment of poor judgment. It was about perpetuating a cycle of mistrust and injustice that had existed long before her. As she left the building, Karen knew this was only the beginning of her journey. Education was the first step, but true change would require consistent effort. She vowed to listen more, judge less, and challenge the biases she hadn't even realized she carried. Though the road ahead seemed daunting, Karen felt a flicker of hope, a small but steady light guiding her toward redemption. Karen's newfound understanding didn't magically erase the damage she had caused, nor did it immediately repair her fractured relationships with her neighbors or herself. But it marked the beginning of a slow and deliberate transformation. Determined to move beyond apologies and empty promises, Karen threw herself into meaningful action. She started volunteering at a local community center that focused on bridging racial divides and fostering dialogue among residents. At first, walking through the doors of the center felt like stepping into uncharted territory. She was acutely aware of how others might perceive her. Would they see her as sincere, or would they dismiss her efforts as performative? The staff at the center welcomed her cautiously but warmly, assigning her small tasks at first, organizing supplies, setting up chairs for meetings, and helping with administrative work. Over time, Karen began attending workshops and discussion groups alongside other volunteers and community members. These sessions were eye-opening, often challenging her deeply ingrained beliefs in ways that left her feeling raw and vulnerable. During one particularly intense session, participants discussed microaggressions, those subtle, often unintentional comments or actions that marginalize others. As examples were shared around the room, Karen recognized some of her own past behaviors reflected in the stories. Her cheeks burned with shame, but instead of retreating into defensiveness, she listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. Her commitment didn't go unnoticed. One day, after weeks of consistent involvement, Linda approached her during a break. "You're really showing up," Linda said with a small smile. "It hasn't been easy for you, has it?" Karen shook her head, admitting that the process was harder than she'd imagined, but also more rewarding. "I used to think I knew what fairness looked like," Karen confessed. "But now I realize I didn't even know where to start looking." Word of Karen's efforts began to spread slowly within the neighborhood. Some neighbors remained skeptical, refusing to believe she could change. Others, however, noticed her persistence and willingness to engage in difficult conversations. A few even joined her at the community center, inspired by her example. Slowly but surely, Karen began rebuilding trust, not through grand gestures, but through steady, consistent effort. One evening, while organizing materials for an upcoming event, Karen found herself working alongside Marcus. He had agreed to help lead a panel discussion about workplace discrimination, sharing his experiences as a black man in a predominantly white industry. When their paths crossed in the storage room, there was an awkward pause. Karen hesitated before speaking, unsure if he'd want anything to do with her. "Marcus," she began softly, I wanted to say thank you for being here. And again, I'm so sorry. For everything." Marcus studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Karen's surprise, he nodded slightly. "I appreciate you saying that," he said evenly. "But actions matter more than words. Keep doing what you're doing." Though his tone was measured, Karen detected a hint of encouragement beneath it. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was progress. As weeks turned into months, Karen continued to immerse herself in the work. She attended town hall meetings, advocated for diversity training programs in local schools, and even organized a neighborhood cleanup initiative aimed at fostering collaboration among residents. Each step forward came with its share of challenges, moments when old habits threatened to resurface or when doubt crept in. But Karen reminded herself why she had started this journey in the first place, not for redemption, but for growth, for herself, her family, and her community. Though scars from the incident still lingered, Karen no longer shied away from them. Instead, she embraced them as reminders of how far she'd come and how much further she needed to go. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose beyond maintaining appearances or enforcing order. This time, her focus was on building something real, a foundation of empathy, accountability, and connection. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, Karen walked it with quiet determination, knowing that every small step mattered. Months had passed since the incident, and Karen's life was beginning to feel different. Not perfect, but undeniably changed. The sting of public judgment still lingered, but it no longer consumed her every waking moment. Instead, she channeled that discomfort into action, determined to prove that her transformation wasn't just surface level. Her days were now filled with purpose. Attending workshops, volunteering at the community center, and engaging in conversations about race and equity that once would have made her squirm. Slowly, people began to notice. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, Karen spotted Marcus and Emily chatting near the curb again. The same spot where everything had gone wrong months earlier. This time, however, their interaction didn't spark suspicion in her mind. Instead, she felt a pang of guilt mixed with admiration for how they carried themselves despite what had happened. They laughed easily, clearly unfazed by her presence or anyone else's opinion. Watching them from a distance, Karen realized she couldn't keep hiding behind small acts of goodwill. If she truly wanted to make amends, she needed to face them directly. Taking a deep breath, Karen stepped outside, her heart pounding as she crossed her lawn. She approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away to give them space. "Hi," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Both Marcus and Emily turned to look at her, their expressions guarded but curious. Can we talk for a minute?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "About what?" he asked bluntly. Emily folded her arms across her chest, waiting silently for Karen to explain herself. Karen swallowed hard, choosing her words carefully. "I know I've already apologized before, but I don't think I did it right. I want you both to know that I've been working on myself, really trying to understand why I acted the way I did. It wasn't fair to either of you, and I'm so sorry for causing all that trouble." There was a long pause as Marcus and Emily exchanged glances. Finally, Emily spoke up, her tone measured but firm. It's not just about saying sorry, Karen. You called the cops on us. For nothing. That kind of thing stays with people. It makes them feel unsafe, like they don't belong here. I know, Karen replied quickly, her eyes welling up with tears, and I'll never be able to take that back. But I'm hoping you'll let me show you that I'm serious about changing. I've been going to workshops, volunteering, listening to stories. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I want to earn your trust. Marcus studied her for a moment, his expression softening ever so slightly. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said finally. But if you're really committed to doing better, then maybe there's hope for you yet. He glanced at Emily, who gave a reluctant nod. Encouraged by their response, Karen pressed on. Thank you for hearing me out. And thank you for being willing to give me another chance, even if it's just a little one. She hesitated, then added, if there's anything I can do to help, or if you ever need someone to stand up for you, I'd like to be that person. The conversation ended shortly after, with neither Marcus nor Emily offering full forgiveness. Still, Karen walked back to her house feeling lighter than she had in months. For the first time, she sensed a crack in the wall of mistrust she'd built, a tiny opening she could work to widen over time. Over the following weeks, Karen continued showing up in ways that mattered. She joined Marcus and Emily at a neighborhood potluck, sitting quietly at their table and listening as they shared stories with other attendees. She volunteered alongside Marcus during a community cleanup event, earning a grudging smile when she joked about nearly dropping a trash bag full of leaves. And she attended a school board meeting where Emily spoke passionately about implementing anti-bias training for teachers, offering her support publicly. Though progress was slow, Karen noticed subtle shifts in how people treated her. Neighbors who had once avoided her now greeted her with polite smiles. Jake, her son, started talking to her again, though their relationship remained cautious. Even Emily and Marcus, while still reserved, acknowledged her efforts with small gestures, a wave across the street, a brief hello at the grocery store. Karen knew she wasn't done. There would always be more to learn, more bridges to mend, and more accountability to embrace. But for the first time, she felt hopeful, not because she had fixed everything, but because she had taken the first steps toward becoming someone worthy of trust. And in a world quick to judge, those steps felt monumental. As the months rolled on, Karen's journey of growth became a quiet but steady force in the neighborhood. Her efforts weren't flashy or dramatic. They were small, consistent actions that added up over time. She attended every community meeting she could, listened intently during discussions about equity and inclusion, and even helped organize events aimed at bringing people together. Slowly, her presence shifted from being a source of tension to something more neutral, and eventually almost positive. One chilly spring morning, Karen woke up early to prepare for the annual neighborhood fair, a tradition she had once approached with a sense of obligation, but now embraced wholeheartedly. This year, she had volunteered to help set up booths and coordinate activities, working alongside Marcus and Emily, who were also part of the planning committee. As they arranged tables under colorful tents, Karen couldn't help but marvel at how far things had come since that fateful day when everything fell apart. At one point, while adjusting a banner, Marcus turned to her with a rare smile. "You've been putting in work," he said simply, his tone lighter than it had ever been before. "I'll give you credit for sticking with it." His words caught Karen off guard, and she felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." Emily chimed in, tying down the corner of the banner with practiced ease. "Yeah, we've noticed. You're not half bad at this stuff anymore." It wasn't exactly high praise, but coming from Emily, it felt monumental. For Karen, it was proof that her efforts hadn't gone unnoticed, and that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to earn their trust. The fair itself was a vibrant celebration of the community, filled with laughter, music, and shared meals. Families gathered around food trucks, kids darted between games, and neighbors exchanged stories under strings of twinkling lights. Karen found herself stationed at a booth promoting local volunteer opportunities, answering questions and handing out flyers. To her surprise, several people stopped by to thank her, not just for organizing, but for the changes they'd seen in her personally. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast a warm orange glow over the park, Karen took a moment to step back and observe the scene. The air buzzed with energy, and for the first time in years, she felt like she truly belonged here, not because she owned a house or maintained perfect flower beds, but because she had earned her place through effort and humility. Jake stood nearby, chatting animatedly with friends, his earlier resentment seemingly replaced by pride. He caught Karen's eye and gave her a small nod, which she returned with a grateful smile. Even Linda, who had encouraged her to attend that first diversity workshop, walked over and patted her shoulder. "Look at you," Linda teased gently. "Who would have thought?" Karen chuckled, shaking her head. "Not me, that's for sure." By the end of the night, as the crowd began to thin and volunteers started packing up, Karen spotted Marcus and Emily sitting together on a bench near the edge of the park. They were laughing about something, their shoulders brushing casually as they talked. Taking a deep breath, Karen approached them hesitantly, unsure if she was welcome. But when they noticed her, neither turned away. "Hey," she said softly, stopping a few feet away. "I just wanted to say, I'm really glad we're all here tonight. Together." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, well, progress is progress. Just don't forget why we're doing this. To make things better for everyone." "I won't," Karen promised, her voice firm. "Never again." As she walked home that night, Karen reflected on how much had changed, not just in her life, but in the neighborhood as a whole. Scars still remained from the incident, reminders of mistakes made and lessons learned. But those scars no longer represented failure. Instead, they symbolized resilience, accountability, and growth. Karen knew she would never stop learning or growing. There would always be moments of doubt, times when old habits threatened to creep back in. But she also knew she had taken meaningful steps toward becoming someone others could count on. Someone who cared less about appearances and more about making a difference. And though forgiveness might never come fully or easily, Karen understood that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a better future, one small act of kindness at a time.